So welcome. So today our speaker is Dr. Caplan. Dr. Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He earned his PhD in economics at Princeton University. He wrote several editorials for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He was also recently featured on ABC's 2020. He also writes for one of the top 10 economics blog called EconLog. And today's talk is about the book he wrote recently called The Myth of Irrational Voters, Why Democracy Chooses Bad Policies. This book was named the best political book this year by the New York Times and the best book of 2007 by the Financial Times. Right? Currently, Dr. Caplan is also writing a book about selfish reasons to have more children. Dr. Caplan?
Thank you very much, Alex. All right, let me begin by saying that even though this is a controversial book, it doesn't begin with a controversial starting point. My claim that voters know very little about politics and economics is very widely accepted by social scientists. It is completely common among political scientists who know the data, completely common among economists. The real point of controversy is this. While social scientists will generally agree that voters know very little about politics and economics, they will often then add, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't really matter that people don't know what they're talking about when they vote. Even though democracy is supposed to be ruled by the people, it doesn't actually require that the people know what they're doing. Right now, this seems like a somewhat surprising claim, right? Because you say, how could it not matter? Right? If you were talking to a doctor who's about to perform surgery, and it turns out that he thinks the heart is on the wrong side of the human body, you might become somewhat nervous and say, look, how can he do his job if he doesn't understand human anatomy? And then somebody says, well, don't worry about it. Somehow he figures it out. Somehow he does a good job, even though he doesn't have a lot of book learning about the human body. You'd probably be very nervous and say, I think you would need some of this book learning in order to competently perform surgery. And I'd be surprised if this guy could cut me open and do no harm, given that he doesn't seem to know what he's doing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it turns out there is an answer that social scientists have to this question of how could it not matter? How could it possibly not matter that voters don't really know what they're talking about? And the answer goes back to basic statistics. In statistics, there's something called the law of large numbers. How many people have heard of this law? Yeah, so this is why, for example, if you roll a whole lot of dice and then take the average, you'd expect the average to be pretty close. You expect the average of the actual rolls to be pretty close to the average, the theoretical average or the expected value. All right. So basically, what basic statistics tells us is that random errors tend to cancel out, which means that in democracy, if people don't know what they're doing, basically just flip a coin to decide what to do, then their random errors will cancel out, which means the well-informed are actually in charge. Okay. So in other words, the defense of how democracy works despite widespread voter ignorance is say, look, the people who don't know what they're doing, flip a coin. Half of them vote one way, half of them vote the other way, and then they balance each other out. And who decides what really happens? The people who decide what really happens are the people who have a lot of information. They're the people who understand what the candidates think. They're the people who understand policy. And for candidates to win, they need their support because the other people aren't paying attention anyway. Okay, so suppose, for example, that we start with a scenario that is more extreme than the one in the real world. Suppose that 90% of Americans literally knew zero about politics. They knew absolutely nothing. So these people don't even know who the president is. They don't know what country they're in. They don't know anything. All right, so, but for some reason, they still want to vote. All right, so they're waiting in line to vote, knowing absolutely nothing. And you go and start chatting with people waiting in line to vote. And you find out, wow, 90% of the people know absolutely nothing. So the election could be between, say, Hitler and some normal candidate. And half the people say, I like the normal candidate. And the other half of the people running for him say, well, that Hitler guy, I don't know, seems nice enough. The mustache is good. All right, so you might get pretty nervous saying, my God, we have a democracy, and almost everyone I talk to doesn't know what they're doing to the point where they're basically just flipping a coin to decide who to vote for. Well, if it's only 90% of the people that you're talking to, though, who don't know anything, then if they're flipping a coin, if you've got a reasonably large number of voters, you can expect that each candidate will get about 45% of the vote, 45 percentage points of the vote. So you may say, well, that doesn't make me feel too good. Hitler's still getting 45 percentage points of the vote. That's kind of scary, right? But then suppose the remaining 10% are perfectly informed. So these people are walking Wikipedias, or they're walking edited Wikipedias, They know exactly what's going on. And you say, well, it's nice to find out that 1 person out of every 10 knows everything. But since this is a democracy, that isn't much of a comfort, because these 10% of people, surely they're going to be overpowered by the 90% of people who don't know what they're talking about. Let's see, we're getting a little feedback here. Okay, let's see. Can we do something about the sound, or is it my fault? Am I doing something wrong? Oh, they're fixing it. Okay, good. Yes. Okay. So we've got 90% of people who are flipping a coin to decide between Hitler and a normal candidate. 10 percentage points of people who know everything, but they're in a small minority. What happens? Well, assuming that the informed people would not want Hitler, right? Which I think is a fair assumption. The 10 percentage points of the people who are informed would not want Hitler. Then actually Hitler's going to get 0 percentage points of their vote. The other guy will get 10 percentage points of the well-informed vote, which means that Hitler will actually lose, getting only 45% of the vote. The other candidate will win with 55%, and everyone can breathe a collective sigh of relief and say, whew, thank goodness that democracy didn't destroy the country this time. Okay, but you may say, well, but what are the odds it's going to work out again? Well, actually, as long as the assumptions that I told you are true, it's going to basically work out that way every time. As long as the uninformed flip a coin and the well-informed know what they're doing, right, and are able to figure out who the better candidate and what the better policies are, then it turns out that what candidates need to do in order to win is to get a support of a majority of the well-informed. Okay, and this is a very general result. As long as there's a reasonably large number of voters, in order to win, you must get a support of a majority of the well-informed, even when the well-informed are a tiny minority of the population. Okay, so this is an interesting result because, of course, suppose that everyone were perfectly informed. What would you need to win in a democracy then? You'd need a majority of the well-informed. All right, what if only 10% of people are well-informed? You still need a support of a majority of the well-informed, which then means people to say, hey, well, the democracy is looking pretty good. It's very robust to this problem of hardly anybody knows what they're talking about. Okay. All right, now this result has a special name. The name is the miracle of aggregation. The miracle aggregation, it sounds like magic. Right? 90% lead, 10% gold, mix it together, and it gives you a result that is as good as 10% or as 100% gold. Okay, now as far as I know in chemistry, this doesn't work. Last time I checked, I'm not that big on natural science, but as far as I understand, medieval alchemy has still not been perfected. So in the realm of chemistry, you cannot mix junk and good stuff to get something that is just as good stuff. However, in democracy, this is a very simple argument for why you can. Why you can combine a population where most people don't know what they're talking about with a small percentage of informed people and get a result that's just as good as if everyone knew what they were talking about. Oh, actually, yes. Okay, so this brings me to one of my favorite sayings, which is if it seems too good to be true, then it probably is. Okay, so anyone here watch late night television and see ads about how you too can start your own alpaca farm? Yeah, so I want to watch late night television. I haven't seen the commercial for a while because now I have a DVR, so I fast forward through the alpacas. But anyway, you too can start your own alpaca farm. These wonderful animals, you go and just send us $3,000, we will ship you an alpaca or two, and before you know it, they will have bred like rabbits, and you will be an alpaca magnate, and anyone can farm these animals in any location, urban, wherever, you just put them out on your balcony, and you'll be making money hand over fist on these alpacas. Just send us your money real fast. Don't go, if anyone tells you this won't work, don't listen to them, they want you to fail. Right? So go and send us the money, we'll send you the alpacas, and this is going to be great. All right, so I have never actually investigated any of these claims, and yet I have not sent them my alpaca money. Right? And the reason is I say, look, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. I just don't believe that I could successfully become an alpaca farmer in my spare time and make money hand over fist. And if that were really true, why would they be selling me these alpacas anyway? It just doesn't make sense. Okay, so my reaction to the miracle aggregation is similar. I say, look, this sounds really good, but how can that be true? It seems like there's something fishy going on here. And it turns out that if you read the fine print, there is a crucial assumption behind the miracle aggregation. And that assumption is that when people don't know what they're doing, they flip a coin. When people don't know what they're doing, they flip a coin. Or another way of putting it is they are just as likely to overestimate as to underestimate. For an even policy, they are equally likely to think that it's better than it really is or worse than it really is. Okay, now, when I first began reading this literature, I noticed that a lot of social scientists make this assumption and then use it to defend everything that they believe in. So I was thinking, wow, these are very smart people. They've put a lot of study into this area. Surely they wouldn't rest their entire belief system on an assumption that they've never even examined. But when I started looking more, I said, wow, looks like there really isn't a lot of evidence one way or the other about whether or not this assumption is true. There's actually very little evidence one way or the other on whether or not people don't know what they're talking about, actually do flip a coin, or are equally likely to over and underestimate. So I found that when I talked to other economists, they would often give me a definitional argument. Say, look, how do we know that people who don't know what they're talking about flip a coin to decide what to do? And many economists would say, well, it would be irrational to do otherwise. Saying, how do we know that it's irrational to do otherwise? Because that's the definition of rationality. You say, wait, there's something wrong here. Isn't that like a circular argument or something like that? Again, my friend Mike Humer, the philosopher, can tell me the technical definition of what that error is, but I was pretty sure that you can't just define things into existence and then make them so. Okay, so that didn't seem very convincing. And then when I went over to political science and talked to them and said, all right, so why do you guys believe that voter errors are random? Often they would give me a deer in the headlights look and say, we believe it because some economist told us it was true. I say, oh, well, you know what? The economists don't really have much of an argument for it either. I say, oh, so we've been basing this all upon an argument from authority where the authorities haven't actually done their homework. Yeah, afraid so. Okay, so of course the fact that there's very little evidence on something doesn't show that it is wrong. So when I began this project, I started by saying, let's go and find some actual evidence on this and see what we can come up with. Okay. Now it turns out there's basically 3 different methods where you might go and test whether or not people who don't know what they're talking about make random errors. Okay, the first one is the most straightforward. This is what I call the method of objective quantitative comparison. So what you do here is, step 1, you find out what the facts are. Step 2, you ask people what they believe the facts are. Step 3, you go and statistically test whether or not the public's average belief is approximately equal to the truth. Okay, so for example, you can first go to the statistical abstract of the United States and find out what percentage of the US budget is spent on foreign aid. And you'll find out the true number is approximately 1% of the US budget. Then you can go and survey a random sample of Americans and ask them what percentage of the US budget they believe is spent on foreign aid. And then if you do this, you'll often get a number of about 10%. Okay? Now, of course, if we only asked 3 people, then it would be very hard to statistically test whether or not this was just bad luck or whether it was really a significant difference. But when you ask a lot of people, then you can apply statistics and say, hey, look, it is extremely unlikely that these 2,000 people that we asked gave an average answer 10%, and yet the average American really believes 1%. Right? It looks like this is some pretty strong evidence that people overestimate the true fraction of money spent on foreign aid by a factor of 10, which is a lot. Right? It is a lot to overestimate something by a factor of 10. Okay? Now, when you apply this method, it turns out that there are large systematic errors on some very important questions. For example, just to take the budget, where this is an area where there's some very clear-cut answers about how much we really spend, and you can ask people how much they think that we spend, and you can see things, for example, that Americans very sharply overestimate the level of spending on foreign aid and welfare, and they very sharply underestimate pension and health spending. Right? Very sharply underestimate pension and health spending. Okay, so that's one approach. A second method that is often used in political science is what is called the Enlightened Preference approach. See what that's, okay. Is that better? Okay, hopefully that's better. Okay, second approach often used in political science is called the Enlightened Preference approach. The idea here is this. Okay, first of all, we get a group of people and we give them 2 different surveys. The first one is a survey that is a test of their political knowledge. So think about that as a political IQ test or a PIQ test. This has questions where there are definite right and wrong answers, such as how many senators does each state have, how many states are there, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So you give them a bunch of questions like this where you see how much they really know about politics, and you score them. Okay? The second test is a survey about their policy preferences. These are questions where you may say there is not an obvious cut and dried answer, right? But we can still find out what it is, what policies that people favor. Okay? So then what we do is we can statistically estimate preferences as a function of people's political IQ plus their other characteristics. Right? So what we do is we see, look, what kinds of policies do people with high political IQs favor? Right? Now if you say, well, maybe people with higher incomes get high, or have more education, so they get to score higher on this test. Well, then if you know some statistics, you say, all right, fine. Let's go and control for that. Let's go and compare people who have similar levels of income but different political IQs, and then see what different kinds of policies the people with higher political IQs favor. Or you can say, well, I think there's a whole bunch of differences between people with high political IQs and low political IQs. You say, fine, let's go and get data on all of those differences and then see whether or not political IQ still makes a difference. Okay, so it turns out that when you do this, political IQ almost always has a substantial effect on the policies that people favor. So it's not just a matter of different people of different interests, but rather within a group of people who are very similar in terms of their objective interests, people who know more generally favor different things than people who know less. Okay? Now then, once you've done this, you can actually take this one step further, and you can simulate what public opinion would look like if everyone had aced the political IQ test. So imagine everyone got a perfect score on that political IQ test. What would they want then? What would the entire population favor in that case? All right, so the result is that people, in fact, would want some quite different policies than the ones that they have. All right, so just to give you one example from a very excellent book by Scott Althouse, political scientist. He has many examples in this book. Pretty much any question you're wondering, what is it that people who know more want more? This book will tell you. All right. So this survey, one survey question that he asked or that he looked at asked which of the following two positions is closer to your views? Quote: 1, we need a strong government to handle today's complex economic problems, or 2, the free market can handle these problems without government becoming involved. Now, if you look at the actual breakdown for the American public, this was 62% in favor of strong government, 38% in favor of free markets. And you can then take a look at the different income, groups of the income distributions, the different income quartiles, and you can see that in the lowest income quartile, it's basically 75% wanted to rely upon strong government, but you can even go to the highest quartile, and you'll see that only 49% of the highest quartile wanted to rely upon free markets. All right, so anyway, the shaded area is what people really said. All right, the unshaded area is what people would have said if they had gotten a perfect score on the political IQ test. Okay, so what you can see is that there is a large increase in support for free markets. It actually is enough to switch the majority position. It goes from 62-38 to 47-53. Now, what's particularly interesting is that this work allowed there to be a different effect for every income group, because you might say, well, maybe informed poor people will be more against free markets, whereas more informed rich people will be more in favor of free markets. What Althouse found is, in this case and in many others, generally information works in the same way for everybody. Okay, so it's not that there's different people with different interests, and if they know more, they are better at picking out their interests, but rather, informed people of all sorts generally see pretty eye to eye. And in fact, in this particular case, the information effect for the lowest group was actually much larger than for the highest income group. So it's very well-informed poor people are much more in favor of free markets than poorly informed poor people. Okay, so just one example, but gives you an idea. Okay, now finally we come to the method that I relied upon, and this is the method of layman-expert comparison. The idea of this approach is to see whether laymen and experts systematically disagree, controlling for other factors. The key assumption that I'm using here, which upsets many people, is that if experts and laymen disagree about something, then the experts are probably right and the laymen are probably wrong. Okay, so people who have studied a subject for many years are more likely to be right than people who have never studied a subject. Okay, so this assumption aggravates many people, but what I will say is, look, I'm not saying this is necessarily true. I'm open to counter-arguments, but I will say this is my starting point, and if someone says that we should rely upon people who've never studied a subject rather than people who've studied it for many years, I'd at least like to know why. I'd like you to explain why exactly it is that we should so distrust the experts on a subject. Okay, the result is that there are very large systematic disagreements on important questions, which include systematically biased beliefs about economics. Okay, now, of course, since I am an economist, this is especially interesting to me, and I won't deny, yes, I love economics. I live and breathe economics. I think all day about economics. All my friends are economists. Yes, we love it. But I will say that there's more reason to be interested in bias about economics than just the fact that economics is the greatest subject ever, except maybe philosophy, of course, for my friend the philosopher. First of all, economics is highly relevant to most modern policy debates. So for almost any policy debate people are having, economics has something to say. Okay. Second reason is that economists have an interesting quirk, which is that we spent a long time complaining about how the public misunderstands our subject. This is different from the complaints that physicists might have about the public. Physicists are likely to say, the public is bored with our subject. The public doesn't care about physics. But I rarely run into a physicist who says that on the first day of physics class, students come out to me and say, look, you physicists believe in gravity, right? Well, let me tell you why gravity's wrong. Helium balloons. Have you ever thought of that, Mr. Professor? All right. Until you can explain that, I don't see why I should have to listen to you. All right. Physicists generally don't have to put up with this kind of abuse. However, economists do. Economists do. Yes, if we teach an introductory economics class, students really will come up to you and said, look, you guys don't understand what's going on with international trade. Really? All right. Share. Do share. You don't understand. These products are coming from China, and their wages there are lower. Now do you understand how wrong you are? No, I still don't understand how wrong I am. In fact, that's a key part of the whole argument. But And then they'll say, oh, well, you're so dogmatic. Well, why don't we wait till we get to that part of the course, and then you can explain to me what is wrong with the textbook. Okay, and yes, I will say that most of my personal experience of this comes with arguing with my dad. Yes, yes. He's a very smart guy. He's a PhD in electrical engineering, and yet he is constantly explaining to me how all the economy's problems can be solved with two simple policy changes. Policy change number one is a naval blockade of Japan, right? Or actually these days it's a naval blockade of China, must include China and just all of Asia to make sure, because you never know what new terrible country will emerge in China and start trying to destroy us. So just blockade off the entire continent. And policy change number two that my dad has long believed would finally restore our country to the greatness we enjoyed in the 50s is a Berlin Wall at the Mexican border. So if we just do these two things, the naval blockade, the Berlin Wall, then everything will be great. Okay, so and again, the fact that I've got a PhD in the subject and has in no way changed his confidence in explaining to me what the answer is. And again, it's not like my dad has read the textbook and says, look, Bryan, on page 38 there's a mistake. Take a look at equation 3. It's not like that. He just has this strong opinion, despite the fact that he couldn't explain to you at all what is in the textbook and has no interest in hearing about it. Well, I told him a few times, but yes, doesn't have any interest. Okay, so economists have been complaining about the public's misconceptions for a very long time, so that's kind of interesting too. Says, so is it, does it actually check out, or is it really just that economist students are saying, hey, you know what I'm going to say to pull this professor's chain? I'm going to tell him we shouldn't trade with China. See what he does. Watch him turn red. Okay. Now, there are some earlier surveys that were done about economic beliefs that were consistent with systematic bias. The main problem is they almost never asked identical questions, so it was always open to people to say, look, the reason why the answers between economists and the public are different is because they were asked different questions. Okay, so what I found was that there is a survey that some other people constructed called the Survey of Americans and Economists on the Economy. And what it did is it asked both an audience, a general American audience, and PhD economists specializing in investing policy, their views about different, on a lot of different questions about how the economy works. Okay, so the main results that I got out of this survey is the miracle of aggregation fails once again. Right? It is once again is not the case that people who don't know anything about a subject just flip a coin, right? Or that they're equally likely to over or underestimate the effects of something. Rather, it turns out that there are very large systematic disagreements between economists and the public. There are clear patterns. Right? People who've never studied a subject, know nothing about it, tend to think that one answer is right, and it's the opposite of the answer that people who've studied the subject think. Right? So it's almost like reverse magnetism, right? Where people who haven't studied a subject are repelled from the truth. Right? So it's interesting, it's curious, but that is what we see. All right, now just to quickly give you some of the main patterns that we can get out of the data. The first main pattern is something that I call anti-market bias. Okay? So there is a general tendency for non-economists to underestimate the social benefits of the market mechanism. Right? Now, this isn't to say that all economists think that markets are great all the time. They certainly don't. But nevertheless, there is a very different perspective that economists have compared to the rest of the public. For economists, they look at a problem and they say, who could get rich by solving this problem? And if you have a good answer, then the economists say, all right, fine, we don't need to worry about it anymore. On the other hand, non-economists will often say, look, there's people getting rich off of this, and that's the problem. Right? A very different reaction. Right? So economists tend to worry about things like air pollution, where they say, we can't think of any way to get rich solving air pollution, so we're worried. On the other hand, non-economists are just as likely to get worried when someone is making money hand over fist solving a problem. Say, look, you don't understand, it's about greed. Right? So what's the problem with that? Well, they really have these greedy intentions, so that's going to lead to bad results. And you have the economist saying, that's not necessarily true. What if the way to get rich is by making the customer happy? Then it would seem like that would lead to good results because people would try to make the customer happy in order to get rich. Right? So what's the problem? Right? Now, there's many examples of this that I could give you, but I like to give you the most controversial examples possible. So here's one of my favorite ones. As I look out throughout this room, I see a very large number of kidneys that people don't need. Right? All right. Pretty much every healthy person in this room has 2 kidneys, and as far as I understand, medically you only need 1. Right? So if you get, you may say, well, don't I need a spare kidney in case you get sick? From what I understand, kidney disease generally affects both kidneys, so you don't really have a spare kidney. You only need 1. And on the other hand, there's probably a number of people right here in Denver on dialysis, which is totally horrible. Right? So horrible that a friend of mine in the insurance industry says that about 20% of people on dialysis just voluntarily go off and die. It's so miserable. All right, so now that you know this, are you inclined to go and donate your kidney to a stranger for free? Feel free to leave, and we'll all cheer you in your act of helping save someone's life. Okay, well, probably you're not going to. because there's actually a law that says that while you may give your kidney to a stranger, you may not charge them for it, which means that there are hundreds of millions of perfectly good kidneys that are just being wasted in the US right now. And on the other end, there's a whole bunch of people who desperately need them who can't get them because they don't have a person who really cares about them who's a compatible donor, then they're stuck. All right? Now, what do economists say about this? And not just weird economists, not just right-wing economists, but almost every economist I've ever talked to. Look, we need to create a market in human kidneys. We need to legalize the selling of kidneys so that people who need a kidney can buy it. Right? And it probably would only cost a few $1,000s, right? Because even if you wouldn't sell your kidney for a few $1,000s, there's a lot of people would. And even if Americans wouldn't, there's a lot of people in other countries who would want to. Right? Which again freaks many people out. Say, well, poor people in other countries would sell kidneys just because they need the money. And again, economists say yes. Poor people who really need money would then go and give kidneys to people who really need kidneys, and this is a problem. Why? Isn't that good? When people who need money get money, and people who need kidneys get kidneys, why is that such a problem? You don't understand. They're poor people. No, I do understand. That's actually why it's even better than it might initially appear, is because they really need that money. Because they're hungry and they don't need a kidney, they need the food. Right? Their child is going to die unless they can sell this kidney, and you won't let them, and why not? Okay, so this is only one example, but it's one that I'm very fond of. Because on the one hand, it's very controversial, and almost everyone thinks it's a bad idea to have a market in human kidneys. And yet, even when I talk to Marxist economists, I said, so what do you guys think about market in human kidneys? Well, the graduate students were sort of like, eh. And then the Marxist professor said, we have to do this. All right. All right, thumbs up to the Marxist economist who told his Marxist graduate students that we do need to legalize a market that almost no American would accept. Okay. So that's one example of anti-market bias. There are others, but we do have limits of time. Another big difference that you see between economists and the public is what I call anti-foreign bias. So it's one thing for Americans to say, look, when one American buys something from another, then probably both are better off. But what if an American buys something from a Chinese? Surely that's totally different, right? And what economists are around to say is, no, it's not different. It's the same thing, right? They're better off, we're better off, and the fact that they're in another country really doesn't make any difference. And probably the best way to explain economists' thinking on this is with a little fable. It is the fable of the factory that turns wheat into cars, right? And here's how the fable goes. A man goes and builds a factory on the coastline, and he says he's got some amazing machine that turns wheat into cars, and you see big trucks full of wheat go into that factory, and then cars come out, right? And then you have a bunch of chemists saying, I don't understand how he does it. Chemically, wheat cannot be turned into a car, right? And they sit around saying, how is this possible? Arguing about what the machine must be. Is it some advanced kind of fusion? Finally, a journalist goes and sneaks in the factory, and it turns out the factory is empty. All that it has are docks and ships. And what do the ships do? Well, they take wheat, they sail them across the ocean to Japan, they put cars on them, and they come back, right? And then there's a giant scandal. The factory shut down. Everyone says how awful. What this guy was doing. It wasn't really a machine for turning wheat into cars. It was just trade with the Japanese. Can you believe what he was doing here? And of course, the economist's point is, no. It was correct the first time. That factory it did contain a machine for turning wheat into cars, not the kind of machine you're thinking about. But the fact that Japanese even exist is irrelevant to the to the technology. The fact there's other people in other countries doesn't make the slightest difference from the American point of view. All that matters is that you put wheat goes in, cars come out. Who cares how you do it? Okay. Another big difference between economists and the public, something we'll call make-work bias. Non-economists tend to evaluate economies based upon employment. Economists tend to do it based upon production. Right? Now, of course, it's easy to understand why people look at employment and say, isn't that a good thing? Well, suppose we come up with a new technology that allows us to produce a lot more with a lot fewer people. For example, the tractor. Right? So in 1850, almost all Americans were farmers. We had a lot of advances in agricultural technology. As a result, a ton of farmers lost their job. And the long-run result, of course, is that we're here today instead of farming. So instead of farming, we are here today listening to this talk. Okay, now, if we had blocked progress in order to save jobs, it's true some people would not have lost their jobs. On the other hand, we also would not have had the modern world. Now, the thing is at the time when farmers were losing their jobs, we've gone to an economist and said, well, what do you expect people to do now they've lost their jobs? Really, all the economists could have said, like, something else? I don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be going and setting up factories to do that something else. Right? So it doesn't seem very convincing at the time to say people lose their jobs, they're going to do something else. But that is the right answer. Certainly in 1850, you wouldn't have said, I don't know, they'll invent the internet or something like that. You wouldn't have any idea what, you wouldn't have even any conception of what that would be. And yet it is because that productivity has been allowed to improve that we have the modern world that we see around us. Right? And the last big difference that we see between economists and the public is something called pessimistic bias. The public is more likely than economists to see a world in decline that is bad now and is going to get even worse. You may be inclined to say, well, isn't that true at least now? Even there, since I remember the 80s, I will say, you know what? Things are still way better than they were in the 80s. Right? In the 80s, so it's like, so what was considered a fast modem in the 80s? Yes, 1200K, right? 1200K. Right? So yeah, that was considered a fast modem. Let's see, I had a VIC-20 that had 4K of RAM, no hard drive. Right? So yes, and of course there was no internet. Right? So, or you just go and look at television. We had like 3 channels. I had a black and white television. In order to get reception, I had to put my hand on the antenna to serve as a human antenna to get the channels to come in. Okay, so I'll compare that to what we have now during the worst recession since the Great Depression. By comparison, things are looking really quite amazing, right? But people tend to focus on the negative rather than saying, wow, things are fantastically good compared to how they were only 20 years ago. Okay, now we come to the question of, could the experts be biased? Of course they can be biased. Right? And there are good reasons to distrust experts. So if you go to an auto mechanic and he says you need a $2,000 repair, you are probably distrustful. And if he says, well, what do you know? I'm the mechanic. I've been doing this for 10 years. You might still say, yeah, but also if there was no problem at all, you can make $2,000 by telling me that I have a big problem. So that's why I don't trust you. And that's a perfectly good reason to distrust an expert. But suppose that you go and talk to a mechanic who knows he's not going to get your business, and he tells you that you need a $2,000 repair. Then you might start saying, I don't know, maybe he knows another mechanic in town, maybe that's his goal. All right, fine. What if it's your son, the mechanic, who tells you you need a $2,000 repair? Then it starts to be kind of paranoid to say, what do you know? I understand this a lot better than you do. This is all part of some scheme. That's a point where you say, you really have, this person has your best interest at heart. You have no reason to trust them. It seems very arrogant to say that you know better when they've studied the subject for years and you don't know anything about it. Okay, that is at least my reaction. Okay. So in terms of reasons to distrust economists, there's actually 2 very popular reasons floating around. And again, economics are not the most popular occupation. There are many people who spend their lives denouncing us. Okay, so, and what are the main reasons they've offered for distrusting us? One is what I call self-serving bias. It says, look, economists are rich, they got tenure, they're fat, they're happy, everything's going well for them. Of course they think that everything is right in the world. Right? So whatever is good for them is good for the world, so naturally they are indifferent to the suffering of others, and they have all these crazy views about the kidneys and so on. All right, so that's one story about why economists can't be trusted. Another one says, look, economists are a bunch of extreme right-wing ideologues. They have been living and breathing hard right republicanism since they were 3 years old. Then they go into economics because that's where they can be with other like-minded ideologues. The only people who go to grad school are people who are dogmatic adherents to this religion. And then they've locked down the occupation because no one who disagrees with this crazy stuff would want to be a part of this horrible club. Right? So that's another story. Okay, call that ideological bias. Well, the main problem with these stories is that they're actually testable. Right? So this is like getting up on a stand and saying, look, the witness couldn't possibly committed the crime because he was elsewhere. Well, then we can go and get the camera footage and see, well, was the guy really out in that other place or not? Right? Similarly, when you go and say the problem with economists is that they're rich, they got job security, they're right wing, well, we can go and get some data and see, well, is that true? And if that's true, let's go and then compare people who are non-economists who are similar in other ways and see how they compare. Okay, so for example, you think that the reason why economists have their funny views is because they're rich and have a lot of job security. Let's go and look at non-economists who are equally rich and have an equal amount of job security and see if they think like economists too. Or similarly, you think that the reason why economists have these strange views is that they're right-wing ideologues. Let's go and find some liberal democratic economists, see what they think, see whether they disagree. It turns out when you apply these tests that the belief gap between economists and the public basically stays the same. Controlling for income, job security, so on, shrinks a very large gap by less than 20%. And controlling for party ideology actually makes the gap a little bit bigger, because here's the thing, it's not even true that economists are right-wing. Typical economist is a moderate Democrat. He's a moderate Democrat who thinks that downsizing is good for the economy, but still he's a moderate Democrat. Okay, so these stories do not check out. Okay, so now in the next question, many economists will say is, look, granted what you're saying is true in fact, how is it possible in theory? Okay, which sounds kind of funny. But to go back to that whole helium and physics example, it's not as funny as it sounds. When you go and see, look, helium balloons float. How can physics explain that? You might want to, before you say the physics has been disproven, you might want to go and talk to physicists and say, look, is there any footnote in your theory about how helium could float? And he may say, actually, yes, and it's not just a footnote. It's actually specifically predicted by the theory. Oh, good. Okay, so all right, so let's see. All right, so how exactly is it possible that the public could be so wrong about so many areas? Okay, well, the standard story that economists give is something called rational ignorance. It says, look, people don't know very much about subjects that they have very little incentive to learn. Okay? So the reason why the public doesn't know much about this is because you can get through life just fine without understanding economics very well. Okay? And something I'll actually say is basically true. I know plenty of successful businessmen who are economically illiterate. So, economics is more about understanding policy than it is about understanding how to run a particular business. Okay? But anyway, rational ignorance, I'll say, actually doesn't work. Now, one thing is that the way that economists normally think about it is actually rules out systematic error, so that's sort of a theoretical problem. But the real substantive problem is this. Rational ignorance does not explain why the uninformed are not agnostic. Normally, if you have never studied a subject, you are agnostic about it. Look, I don't know anything about the history of ancient Samaria, therefore I don't have strong opinions about ancient Samaria. Whatever, I don't know. Was it a monarchy? Was it a matriarchy? No. All right, and if someone who had studied it told you, you wouldn't say you're lying or you're evil. You'd say, oh, well, the guy who studied it says that, I guess he's right. Okay, so this doesn't explain why the uninformed are not agnostic, and yet if there's one thing that you can see in the public's economic views is that they are not agnostic about much. Right? People who cannot explain anything about the international trade textbook generally are convinced that we must do much more to keep out foreign products. They have a strong opinion almost precisely because they don't know anything about the subject. Okay? And the same goes for many other areas. Right? Basically, almost everyone who can explain the economic argument for legalizing market human kidneys agrees with the argument. And on the other hand, the people who don't believe in legalizing market human kidneys, pretty much none of them can explain the standard argument. And again, of course, there's a difference between being able to explain an argument correctly and agreeing with it. But it is interesting to see that mere ability to explain what the argument is generally leads to agreement. And of course, lack of ability means that you disagree. Okay? Now, another thing that rational ignorance does not explain is emotionalism. Why do people get upset about this stuff? Why do the people start screaming and yelling about subjects they know nothing about? Well, if it's just rational ignorance, you'd think that people wouldn't really care. So look, I don't know anything about it. Why would I get upset about it? And yet, I have found in general that if you go to a political meeting and politely disagree with everything that they stand for, you will not make a lot of friends there. Right? My lawyer tells me not to advise you to actually do this, but hypothetically, if you want to test this out, just go to a meeting of people that you totally disagree with and in the friendliest possible way, explain why they're wrong about everything and see how many friends you make. It would be an interesting experiment if one were to try it. Let's say that. Okay, now here I think about the case of the tariff. So, again, coming back to my dad. So in the 90s, Bill Clinton imposed a tariff on Mexican oranges. And at the time I was thinking, so what would my dad say about this? Well, according to rational ignorance, my dad would say, I didn't know there's a tariff on Mexican oranges. Who knew? Or you would say, what's a tariff? Or like, where's Mexico? Right? But or what's Mexico? But I said, that's not how my dad would react. The way my dad would react would be, it's about time we finally got tough with the Mexicans. Those oranges have been ruining our country. The only question is whether we can come back from the brink. Right? That is a more common reaction that you get to in discussions of tariffs. Right? So it does not seem consistent with rational ignorance. Okay. So this brings me to my alternative story, which I call rational rationality. And it begins with the question of this. Why would people be rational some of the time but irrational other times? So I noticed. So again, if I were stranded on a desert island and I had to pick one person I knew to save me, I'd probably pick my dad because he knows how to build stuff. He can go and take a scrap heap and turn it into a car. All right, so I can't do that. I wouldn't know where to begin. So I think my dad could save my life. So, and very few of my other friends could do that. So very rational in areas like being able to build a raft out of makeshift materials on a desert island. On the other hand, though, on the question of the tariff, completely ridiculous. Okay, so why would this be? Well, here's my answer. Why don't we think about irrationality as a good that we use to protect comforting beliefs from reality? Right? So, and again, the problem with being rational is that you might have to change your mind. If you're open to facts and evidence, or you have facts, evidence, logic, then you always have to worry. Maybe someone's going to come along with some evidence that shows I'm wrong, and then I'm going to have to throw away a belief that means a lot to me. Whereas, if you're totally irrational, you can keep believing whatever you want forever, right? Indefinitely, right? If you're irrational, then whatever it is you believe today, you can continue to believe for the rest of your life, and no one can stop you. Okay. So why don't we just go and apply our usual economic tools here? We can put the quantity of irrationality on the x-axis, put the price of irrationality on the y-axis. And think about this. Some errors are costly and others aren't. Okay? So, for example, if you are a surgeon who is so arrogant that you would get great pleasure from believing that you are better drunk than other people are sober, I'm a better surgeon drunk than other surgeons are sober. I'm that good. Well, on the one hand, that's a pleasant belief, but on the other hand, that is a belief that is likely to destroy your career. So few surgeons hold that belief. Right? On the other hand, there are other subjects where you can be dead wrong forever and you can live out your life in perfect comfort, safety, and wealth. Okay, so and what are these areas? Well, areas like religion, philosophy, politics. Errors are basically free. Right? You can be totally wrong about this stuff and does not actually ruin your life. Right? In fact, you can run a successful business while thinking that we need to put a Berlin Wall around a Berlin Wall at the Mexican border. Okay. All right, now, or just to go back for 1 second. Again, so why exactly is that anyone would want to be rational? Well, so one basic thing is that people often get a lot of comfort out of their worldview. One of my favorite books is called The God That Failed. It's a bunch of autobiographies of ex-communists. And not one of them said, I was happy to learn that communism was wrong because then I stopped being wrong. Instead, every single one of them said it was like having my heart ripped out of my chest to have to admit that I was wrong about something I devoted so much of my life to. Right? People have a lot of beliefs where to admit that they were wrong would hurt them, and hurt them quite deeply. Right? So by being irrational, they can prevent that from happening. And of course, the other thing is a lot of times people pick friends based upon shared beliefs. So you might lose your friends if you change your belief. Right? So maybe you say, no, my friends wouldn't purge me just because I stopped agreeing with them. Then again, maybe they would. Or maybe they just like you a little bit less. Right? So another reason not to think about this stuff too much. Okay. All right, now to ask a question that many economists would pose. So why is this inefficient? Maybe all this shows is that the point of democracy is not to pick wise policies. Maybe the point of democracy is to serve as a giant system of group therapy. So it's a chance for all of us to feel good. Right? So we go and say a lot of nonsense, but we feel better about it, and that's the point. Well, the main problem with this is that there's a big difference between what economists call the private cost of voter rationality and the social cost of irrationality. Okay? So the classic example of this is pollution. Right? Where one more person drives a car, it makes pollution a little bit worse, but it's barely noticeable. Right? It is not against a person's interest to drive a car rather than walk, right? Because they do make the air a little bit dirtier, but it's so slight they can't even detect it. However, if a lot of people think this way, then everyone can be choking and coughing and wearing gas masks, right? As people sometimes will in some very polluted third world cities. Okay? So there's a difference between the private cost, the harm that is just done to one individual, and the social cost, the harm that is done to all the people who suffer the consequences of an action. All right? Well, we can think about voter rationality as being a kind of political pollution. The majority can easily be better off if it doesn't get the policies the majority wants. A majority can vote for protectionism, every person feeling all patriotic and wonderful because they vote to keep out Chinese products, and yet it can still be a country they wouldn't want to live in when you actually have the consequences. So why is it they would vote for policies they don't want to live under? Because one person can't actually change what the policies of a country, right? So if you go in and change your vote, would that have changed the outcome of the last election? Highly unlikely. Very, very, very unlikely. Okay, so the chance is quite small. So basically, it's the same thing with driving your car. Do you make the air a little bit more polluted when you drive your car? Yes, but not to a noticeable degree. Okay. All right. So let's see. How much time do I have here, Alex? 10 minutes. Well, in that case, I will leave remedies for the Q&A, and I will open it up to questions. Let's see. Happy to take any question on any topic in economics. I may not know, but sure.
Not really a question, but I was hoping you could talk more about how anti-market bias and these biases play out. Because I thought the examples were in the book are really interesting. Maybe since we have time, you could share.
Sure.
Examples of bias.
Right. So the most basic model in political science is called the median voter model, and it basically says that politicians move to the center of the distribution of public opinion in order to win. And while there are some problems with that, I think it's a very good starting place. So when we're considering, so suppose most people think that protectionism is a good policy, then what does a politician need to do in order to get elected? He needs to say, I'm a protectionist, and I'm going to give you the policies that you want. Right? That is the way that you get elected, is by adopting policies that most people agree with. So that is basically my step one, is to say, if most people believe that a policy is good, then democracy is going to tend to deliver it. And one of my standard challenge that I offer to students is this: tell me the policies that exist that are unpopular. Tell me the policies that exist that are unpopular. Now, of course, many people believe that whatever they like is popular and all their friends agree with them, so therefore the fact the policy doesn't exist is inexplicable. They say, you know what, oftentimes you are weird and your friends are weird too, so you need to go to nationally representative public opinion data, and then you will often be shocked to learn that policies that you think are totally indefensible are supported by most people. To take one example that economists talk about, most economists are under the delusion that the only reason why we have farm subsidies is because 2% of the population wants them, and they force them down the throats of the other 98%. Yet, in the best survey ever done of support for farm subsidies, about 60% of Americans supported them. Actually, it was more like 80% supported them. And then about 80% of Americans support farm subsidies. These percentages are similar in farm and non-farm states. And you say, like, why is it that, that people in non-farm states want farm subsidies? Well, the answer is that, like one standard answer is they say, look, we need it in order to make sure there's enough food. Right? That's the kind of argument that most non-economists will give for why we need farm subsidies. It's to keep the food in the stores. Okay? Which, economists will say, you realize there's only like a few products that get subsidized, but there's like 10,000 products in the store. So how would you explain that? It's like, well, we only subsidize the ones that wouldn't be in the store if we didn't subsidize them. Aha. All right. That fits the facts perfectly. Okay. So now, if you want to, to get a more sophisticated theory, I think actually the real mystery of politics is why policy is not a lot worse. Because once you look at public opinion, I often look at it and I'm in total despair and I say, my God, I can't believe that we've ever got out of the cave the way that people think. I mean, it just seems like their views are so awful. And so, so what's going on? Well, I mean, part of my explanation here is that if politicians were to do exactly what the public asked for, it would be a disaster, and the public would get very angry at the public for causing a disaster. So politicians have to carefully weigh how much to listen to the public. I often think about the case of Gray Davis in California, who, as far as I can tell, was thrown out of office because he did exactly what Californians told him to do, and it was a disaster. And so he paid the price. The next guy isn't going to make that mistake. The next guy is going to say, I'm going to do like half of what the public wants. And the stuff that's going to be really disastrous, I'm not going to do because then they're going to blame me for doing what they asked. Right? So I was saying, writing this book, I actually started to acquire some sympathy for politicians, realizing, well, these guys really are in a lose-lose situation where people hate them if they don't do what they ask, and they also hate them if they do what they ask, and it turns out as any economist would predict. Okay, so not too much sympathy, but some. See, do we have time for one more question?
No.
Okay, here we go.
10 more minutes.
Oh, we have 10 more minutes. I thought you told me originally I had 10 minutes.
I thought you had 10 more minutes to finish your talk.
10 more minutes to finish the talk. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about, economically, about the financial situation, the banking and all of that, and the perception that it's a failure somehow of the free market?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. There's so much to say, but first key thing to point out is that people generally leap to the conclusion that the free market is completely to blame for this, whereas they say, look, it is not true that there is no regulation of banking. Far from it. There's a lot of regulation of banking. There's a lot of regulation of financial markets. So when we look at what has happened, we see, look, there's some element of markets, there's some element of government. The fact that people leap to the conclusion that markets are to blame and that regulation is the solution is, I think, a very clear illustration of anti-market bias, where something goes wrong, there's actually two suspects, and everyone points their finger at the one suspect. If you go into a room and there's a crime has been committed, there's blood on two people's hands, and each of them says, hey, it's the other guy did it, and I was just trying to help the victim. You say, well, but you're always to blame for it. I am? How do you know that? Well, because I just blame you for everything. Okay, so I think that is a very useful point to begin with, is to look, it is not true that there has been no regulation. It's basically not even true to say there has been deregulation. Right? There have been, as far as I can tell, there's been no major deregulation of banking or financial markets that people point to over the last 10, 15 years. So to go and blame deregulation for this seems particularly odd. Okay, so that is key first step, just to say that when you look at the situation, at least be open-minded to the possibility that government may have something to do with it or may have a lot to do with it. Second key point is there are actually a number of things that government plausibly has done that has made the problem worse. So particularly you can take a look at that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two government-sponsored corporations, which are in as big trouble as anybody else. So it's not like when government is involved, they somehow become far-seeing and can see through the problem. Okay, so I think that's a key part of it. In the end, what I will say is this: I think government bears a lot of the responsibility, but people in markets did mess up too. And probably the best way of thinking about this is there's something that I call the banana subsidy story. All right, so suppose government goes and subsidizes bananas, and you go and you get a bunch of subsidized bananas, and then you go and put a ton of them on your roof, and the roof collapses. All right, in a sense, government is to blame. In the sense, though, you didn't have to put those bananas on your roof. Okay, and I think that is a lot of what has gone on with the financial crisis. Is government did encourage people to do a lot of things that were foolish, and then people did those things. However, it still would have been smarter on their part not to have done those things. Right? So, and if they had been a bit more foresighted, they would not have made those mistakes. The main thing I'll say is this, which many people find unsatisfactory, but it's worth pointing out. Once in a century bad mistake will happen. Okay? And it is not like this was a mistake that was so obvious that a lot of people who were smart and clever were months or years before saying, we can tell how this is going to end up. So if you are anything like me, I was as surprised by it as anyone, which suggests to me that it's actually was not a foreseeable thing. It is actually extremely difficult to foresee. Even people who are experts in this industry did not foresee what was happening. Sometimes it happens that a really bad thing happens that was just really hard to see in advance. And then afterwards, everyone says, it should have been foreseen. It seems pretty hard to believe. So if you go out on lunch today and you get in a car crash and you break your leg, should you have foreseen that? Well, it's like you say, look, like once every 10 years they get in a car crash and you get injured. Does that show that that you're making mistakes or that you're foolish or in general? It sounds to me like that is just a case where most of the time when everything seems fine, everything really is fine. Every now and then, though, something seems fine and it's really not fine, and then something bad happens, and then people go and point their fingers and say the market is totally to blame, and let's go and give more power to the part of the system that bore at least a lot of the responsibility. So that is my best story so far.